want to welcome each and every person who is listening to this lesson. I'm Dr. Taiti. Thank you for learning together with me. Now we look at the components of hydroponic system. The components or the main parts of a hydroponic system. One, we have a greenhouse. The greenhouse itself comprises of the galvanized steel framework. The galvanized steel, very strong. This one is actually very, very strong, and it's a very nice framework. It is the one that is supporting the polyvinyl or the grazing. This is what we call the grazing or the polyvinyl. It's actually a material that is UV treated. Remember, we don't want the UV light. The UV light degrades. It actually has effects on people, on plants, and it is filtered by this grazing. This grazing is UV treated, and it runs on the upper part of the greenhouse. Remember, we want to screen off the rainfall. The key function of this grazing is to screen off the rainfall and the UV light. Note that all the heads are netted. This is for air circulation and especially management of the temperatures. Different crops require different temperatures for their growth, maximum growth and productivity. So when the temperatures are low, and especially in the night, the outer grazing is lowered and the net is covered. During the day, and especially around midday when the temperatures are high, the outer grazing is rolled up, like now what they have done, and air can easily circulate. So that is the net. We have the four sides are netted, and the net again is a pest net. It is preventing insect pests from getting into the greenhouse, and that is one of the advantages of this type of hydroponic farming system, in that you are not going to use more of pesticides because the devil has been better kept at bay. So that is very important to note. The insect pests and any other microorganism cannot access the greenhouse. We have a curtain on the lower side to prevent, again with the grazing, to prevent water splashes. If it rains heavily, we cannot have water splashes again coming into the greenhouse. Remember, we are talking about hydroponic farming system and the components. Now we have the reservoirs. You must have the reservoirs. These reservoirs are basically two. You have the feeding tank and you have the breeding tank. From the feeding tank, then you have the delivery system. The delivery system up to the breeding tank. Those are now the reservoirs, the two tanks. Now these are the feeding tanks. So you come with your nutrient mix and add up. You add up and then it becomes now the feed. Once it becomes the feed, it is going to run from that gate valve. There is a gate valve at the top there. Then the gate valve is opened. Once the gate valve is opened during the feeding time, the nutrient solution runs through this main pipe through a filter. There must be a filter to filter off any unwanted particles that can clog and block the drip lines. Remember that we don't need any blockage of the drip lines. So we need a filter to filter any particulate matter or materials that were never suspected to be in the water. So once now the filter has done its work, it runs through the main pipe and it gets into the feeding pipe. The nutrients now get into the feeding pipe, and then it runs through the drip system. That is how the mechanism is working here. Remember, our feeding tanks must be at a higher ground because this is what we call level feeding, and we must generate sufficient pressure that can sustain the 80 troughs. And our 8 troughs have 2 lines of drip lines. They must have pressure that can sustain the crop, even if you want to do 3 times feeding per day or 4 times feeding per day. This is now what we are calling one of the other reservoirs. Remember, we have talked about 2 reservoirs. One is the feeding and is at a higher elevation for level feeding. Now, after the excess nutrients are drained into this other reservoir, this is what we call now the breeding tank. Remember, the breeding tank must be at a lower elevation because this is level feeding. If the water is at good pressure or from the the feeding tank, it runs through once you open the valve, it runs through the feeding chamber, feeding each and every plant in that chamber. Then the excess, again, from the head connector of the chamber, it is connected, it's delivered into the breeding tank. Remember, the breeding tank must be kept closed always because of you have excess nutrients inside here. If it rains heavily, and this is a rainfall area, high rainfall area, it's going to dilute. It's going to dilute your nutrients, all right? And then you are going to have a problem with dilution. So it must be kept always closed like that. And that is why we have this molding to take care of excess water, and again also to prevent contamination from the splash, the soil splash around the breeding tank. Now we look at the delivery system as a key component in the hydroponic farming system. We start with the main feeding line. So from the feeding tank, nutrients are delivered to this main feeding line. From the main feeding line, we have now the lasers that are going to deliver the nutrients into the valves. And as you can see, we have valves that can control nutrient delivery into any feeding chamber, all right? Any feeding chamber. At times you might even decide to do different crops, and you want to feed this crop today and you don't want to feed it together with another crop. So you can actually control that. The drip lines are part of the delivery system, and they come in different measurements and dimensions depending on, again, the crop and the spacing. The key thing here is the spacing. Generally, a standard drip line should have drippers. This, as you can see them, these are the emitters where the water drips. Should have a spacing of 20 centimeters, at least 20 centimeters. You can do 30, but you can also do 20. 20 is the standard, so that even if you want to do a larger spacing, there is still enough feeding area for your crops. The other one is you have the feeding chambers, popularly known as the maple troughs. The maple troughs hold your media properly so that you can actually feed to the brim. And again, they are supported by the ribs, by the sides. And at the end, you have trough connector or a feeding chamber connector at the end, as you can see, the feeding chamber connector. Then from the feeding chamber connector, the excess nutrients lands into the breeding tank. From the breeding tank, that is where now the pump comes in as a key component. The pump comes in to pump now the excess nutrients, or the ones that were not absorbed or diffused in the plant, back into the feeding tank. The other key component of the hydroponic system is the support system. The support system comprises of the upper trellising lines, and the lower trellising lines. These are what you call the lower trellising lines. And remember that they must be anchored. They must be anchored by a support. They must be anchored by a support that is not, again, too low and not too high. Now, these ones are going to give you an easy time to do what you call crop management. There are crop managements that are key for crop production at hydroponic farming. And training the crop by the use of soil tines, and again the trellising, if you are talking of the indeterminate varieties of tomatoes, will be a function of how well have you placed your support system, the upper trellising lines and the lower trellising lines.